Welcome to CISO Insider, Nightfall's chat with Chief Information Security Officers. We host CISOs from different industries to discuss their pathways to the role, the challenges they face in their everyday work, and lessons they can share with anyone aspiring to become a CISO. This podcast brings you into the world of cybersecurity and gives you a window into the most brilliant minds in the business. I'm Chris Martinez. Today on CISO Insider, Ty Sbano from Sisense joins us to talk about what makes him get out of bed in the morning as an InfoSec leader, how he became an advisor to Nightfall, and a lot more. Please join us in welcoming Ty to CISO Insider. So let's start with the first question. Tell us about yourself and your educational background. What drew you into tech at an early age, or if you discovered it later in life?
Okay, that's a big loaded question. So let's start with the education piece. And then let's zoom back into kind of more the early childhood aspect. Formal education, I did my undergrad at Penn State University, Bachelor of Science in Information Science and Technology with a focus on security. So there were multiple tracks within this major. This was when they started phasing out MIS and ultimately started saying business and computers. And that's when computers were still a word for kind of having work afterwards. A big piece of this was also I did a minor in Japanese. I'm half Japanese, and that allowed me to pad my GPA, but I didn't really care about my GPA at this time for my undergrad. And frankly, I don't think it matters all that much going forward in your life either. But doing my undergrad, I think it did lead to kind of the direct path into the security world. The difference is that there wasn't a lot of money in 2006 when I graduated, and I didn't really make all that much. And I'm very favorable that the direction of the world of security has kind of allowed me to operate in. After that, probably about 6 years into my career, I went out and I looked for a master's program that didn't require a lot of on-site or in-person experience, because I wasn't really looking for that as far as my growth plan. I really looked at CISOs out in the world and pictured, what are the characteristics? What are the development opportunities? What are the things that they work on and have on their resume as well? Masters is one of those things that you just kind of expect to see. For me, I wanted to work on more of my ability to write technical sort of messages, executive communications, all that stuff. I'm not going to say it got better because of it, but I will say it probably improved. But over an 18-month intensive program, I did my master's of information assurance at Norwich University and graduated summa cum laude, which was cool for me because I think there's a difference. And the reason I mentioned the GPA is when you pay for it all yourself, you start to care about the outcome and results. And I think when I did my master's, I'm like, if I get an A minus, now it's a much different experience of like, I could have just did it all and I did it right. And in this scenario, like I came out much different than before. And I think I just appreciated it a lot more because all of my personal money was going into it, as opposed to, the folks that helped me with my undergrad, which was my dad by and large, and then my grandparents too, that helped me get that start into my career. Outside of that, I've earned a few certifications along the way, some that expired, like some of the earlier SANS GSEC. That was like one of the first that I got, which was general security certification. And it expired after 2 years. SANS is pretty expensive to maintain. But I ultimately went the road of what are the certs that kind of last a while with CPEs and a few other things that you have to manage. So I got the ISC Squared's SSCP, which you don't really have to get anymore. The CISSP, which is the gold standard. CEH is Certified Ethical Hacker. It wasn't as big as before when I was taking it, but I think it's found a little bit more footing. And then the CCSK I did 3 years ago, which is a cloud security of knowledge, which I'm not going to say it was the best. I'm not going to say it was the worst, but it was just another thing that I got done. A few others in there along the way, but I think those are the main ones that really kind of mattered. Pulling back to your first question, I think security is a mindset, and I don't think it's something you can really teach. And really, it's an element of curiosity. I think there's a lot of patterns and behaviors that you find among security practitioners of why and how do I make this work better for me, or how do I turn this around and get some sort of use out of it that wasn't intentional? For me, it was breaking down a lot of electronics. It started with telephones, anything that was an old electronic that just sat around. I was just fascinated about why did these things work? And then ultimately getting my first computer, which my dad bought for me. And he had no interest, no desire, no need for a computer. But his idea was, let me get this and see what happens. Just going to create an opportunity. And for me, it was educational games. It was a lot of figuring out, how the early stages of computing worked. But yeah, it was a lot of educational games with a Commodore 64. And slowly but surely, this thing started getting into more of, I wouldn't say a hobby. It was just more of the instinctual aspect of wanting to learn, grow, and create. So I think for a lot of security practitioners, you go down that road. And then depending on how you go, maybe you do some bad stuff along the way. Maybe you don't. If you do bad stuff, do it before you're 18. And after you're 18, definitely curtail it unless you're going to make a lot of money and maybe want to live outside of the US or places without cyber laws.
Nice. Yeah, thank you for going into that. That's very fascinating, and I think it tells us who you are on a very fundamental level. So next question, what was your first job out of college?
Yeah, so one of the things for me, I don't typically describe it. I usually go right into the job, but I think for this series, it's worth mentioning. So throughout basically not my freshman year, starting in my junior year, I always had a job. Either it was part-time as a resident assistant, a computer lab technician, doing something additional, basically. By the time I got to my junior year, I was working part-time as help desk. And it was through one of my friends whose dad was working in one of the health and human development university at Penn State. So one of the colleges within the college. And then he gave me an opportunity. And typically within this department, they usually let their children work as employees. And every now and then they would make an exception because there was only so many hours that they could hand off for troubleshooting, fixing PCs, configuring email, like all this stuff for end users. So I had an opportunity there, and that actually spawned into an additional opportunity. So my friend is Justin Grunberg. His dad is Craig Grunberg. He gave me my first real fundamental break, is the way I looked at it. One, I was working on a lot of technical things with configuring, Windows environments, also testing Windows environments, maybe not asked to test those environments, but, when you piss off your sysadmin because you can do a net send across the entire organization, and then the next day the change is made, but there is absolute anger and animosity in the moment that you do it. But you're sitting there like, yeah, you can be angry that I did it, but you can also not be angry that someone else didn't do it and actually exploited the rest of our base of employees in the org. So it was one of those really weird, unique scenarios where as I was exploring security was still early, some of those thought processes started kind of cranking in my head. At the same time, I also became a web manager at Penn State as well, and I hosted one of the websites that was out there for the Pennsylvania Office of Rural Health. So I worked full time in my senior year, and that allowed me to figure out this thing called lack of balance, which I will get to later, where you should achieve balance. And so I was working 40 hours a week. I was doing my last year of school. I was partying a lot, like most people do in that last year. And ultimately, through that transition period, I locked in my first job the second semester before my last. So my last semester was really a lot more socially entertaining because you have a job already lined up versus everything else prior to that. You're taking it pretty seriously as far as your GPA. So my first real security gig was at a company called Protivity. It's a small consulting shop. I think it's like 3,000 employees still worldwide. But I was a security and privacy risk consultant. And I left as a senior security, privacy, and risk consultant. But I did everything under the sun, from penetration testing remotely, doing PCI-based scans, payment card industry, all the way to doing red teams on site where I was going and breaking in environments, literally stealing laptops and then showing up at the CEO's office, that same business week after they caught me and being like, here are 11 of your employees' laptops. Here's the Post-it note with all their names. And he's like, this is going to be a rough day for all of these people. And that, you reflect on it, but at the same time, it taught me a lot about kind of the consultant mindset, especially when you're coming right out of school. Like, you got to learn something really quick. You have to figure out how to not be an expert, but almost have empathy as an expert, because you're going to go deal with real experts. So if you try to bullshit a bullshitter, it doesn't ever work, right? So if you get to the head of IT at one of the world's biggest insurance companies and you're like, hi, my name's Ty. I did like Cisco ASA configurations when I was in college and for some of my degree, but I've never done anything to the level of complexity that you do. But I've been given a piece of software called Red Seal that allows me to analyze all your firewall rules. But when I present results or findings, I want to have the empathetic view of, like, how would I take this information and feedback from someone that doesn't know jack about my system, me, how I thought, what the tech debt is, all this stuff. And then how do I present it in a way that actually renders value? And I think for that first job, I learned that element that security is usually underappreciated, overworked, but at the same time, when presented with someone trying to help, the openness element actually can be turned on its head, because I think a lot of people are very resistant, and the terminology is typically calling your baby ugly because you do a pen test, you hand over the results, you say, everything sucks, good luck. Whereas even if you contour your language a little bit to say, hey, we did an assessment, some of the common vulnerabilities maybe in the OWASP top 10, you were great here, but maybe we got to do some misconfiguration checks here now and then. Maybe we can automate that. And here's what I can offer to help. Other than that, if you got a better answer, I'm happy to explore that. But that piece gave me empathy. It also led me to the discovery that fintech and financial services is where I wanted to gear towards. So that's when I started tracking my career more in that direction.
Nice. Yeah, I totally agree that a lot of STEM disciplines are missing that human connection. So
Yep.
awesome you're bringing that into your work. Did you know you wanted to be a CISO early in your career, or was it something you realized later?
I don't know. I sat down and I was typing this out for the past 2 nights, and I don't think it's something you right out of the gate aspire to be. Maybe if you end up in a security team, you're like, that's the person, that's the kind of the top, and you say that's what you want. But for me, it wasn't that. I think I'd worked at a lot of organizations, and you get mixed experiences when it comes to CISOs. There's a range of personality traits and types, and we'll get more into some of the challenges of being a CISO. It's not an easy job. It really isn't. But I think the folks that inspired me, Glenn Foster, who was the kind of the director of information security for the corporate internet group. He is now the CISO over at TD. I keep in touch with him every so often, but a lot of really good discussions with Glenn over my time at JP Morgan Chase. A lot of great opportunity ultimately is that I did a lot of early things in application security when most people didn't understand what like Ajax calls were, or like really the emergence of where we're going with technology. And I worked on like the first mobile banking app. I worked on the BlackBerry Storms mobile banking app for Chase. And like, who remembers a BlackBerry one? Who remembers a touch UI for the BlackBerry, which was terrible? So even trying to test that bad boy was really tough. Also in the same vein, like when I transitioned out of that role to another role, Chris Tigner, who was the CISO at Capital One at the time, but really the biggest influencer in my career was Sidney Klein, who is one of the senior directors of information security, and my direct manager, Brian Orm. Brian, I'm in touch with all the time. He's on like my personal board of directors, my mentor for probably life at this point. Sydney is just one of those people that showed me going from more of the individual contributor mindset of being an army of one. So taking what I did in the consulting world, and she opened up the mentality and the ideology for me of no longer being just an army of one and showcasing what you can do as a team, showcasing how you can actually create and build something much more powerful than yourself and longstanding. And by showing that power, that's something that has resonated with me. And I've taken that, I took that inspiration. And I think honestly, that was probably the moment where I thought, maybe I could do this at a larger company, but I got to figure out slowly but surely how to get there. And two things kind of happened. One was definitely Sydney. She's now the CISO over at Bristol Myers Squibb. She's awesome. There's also elements here from my time at Capital One where we did mergers and acquisitions. So we acquired a bunch of startups, large financial institutions. And for me, I was enamored with the startup realm, especially out in California and some of the tech companies out of like Austin, where when they were acquired, most of them didn't have a CISO, they didn't have security. So I got this in my mind as far as, wow, I wonder if these companies would want security. And as I found out over the years, many early stage startups do not. The world has changed. It's really cool to see that. But another part of that was trying to build the track to get to that point, because as much as I want to be a CISO of a large company, I didn't have the skills to do it. And I'm not one to fake it till I make it. For me, it's like, how do I skill up in a different area, get my technical skills as an IC, because no startup's going to hire a team of 20 or 40. And, that's when you're managing all these folks as a director in a Fortune 50 or 11, you start to have that type of experience where it's a lot of pointing and telling versus doing and thinking and strategically planning and meeting with the board. So you're going up and down the stack. So for me, I created a plan at that time to start moving downstream to a small to medium business and then ultimately become a CISO. And now I'm on this retrack of no longer software security and product security, but everything security. I want to start in the small to medium business area. I think I've fallen in love with the early stage startup realm and late stage. I don't know if I want to go back to, Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 specifically. I'm open to the idea, but it's just a much different experience and skill set than you would have when you're building something from the ground up with, say, founders, founding engineers, people that are trying to figure out what is product market fit. And that's pretty exciting. So for me, being a CISO and having that realization came through a number of different inspirations. And then again, opportunity. I think the world has changed because people care about security and privacy a little bit more today.
Yeah, definitely. And that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. All right, next question. What were some of the challenges you faced early in your career?
For me, I kind of refined this because there are so many challenges, right? I don't want to get into the elements of like running into the glass ceiling at a young age and kind of getting into leadership and management programs. I definitely ran into that being under 30 and getting a director title. Some people can be bitter about that. So I'm not going to focus on that. I'm just going to mention it. The big piece I'm going to focus on is kind of sacrifice and risk tolerance. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of folks end up enamored with the idea that they get a degree or they start working in a thing, in a vertical, and they're trying to specialize, but they don't open themselves up to making real sacrifices to achieve some goals. And what I mean by sacrificing risk tolerance is determining what is your balance to go and achieve these goals. For me, I grew up in a military family. We relocated a couple of times. It wasn't that crazy, but not everyone is in that mindset, right? And I think when you think about sacrifice for your career and your growth, especially early on, I moved for every job, from the first job to the second job to the third job. Now, just because of the last two jobs I've stayed in San Francisco, it's because now I have a lot more experience. I've decided I'm going to be here for a while, but there are just so many opportunities in San Francisco as opposed to the other locations I had moved to. Different opportunity, but at right time, right place, right offer. And when you take those types of risks, you have to evaluate what is your tolerance. And for me, being younger, it was massively wild because, like, what do I have to lose? And now I'm in a different situation. I have some things to lose, but my risk tolerance is much higher. And for me, I reflect back on a conversation with Glenn Foster when I told him I was leaving JP Morgan Chase to go to Capital One. He said, Ty, I think you're taking too many risks in life right now. I'm like, what are you talking about, Glenn? He's like, well, one, you just explained to me that when you're leaving. Okay, I kind of get that. We tried to work out an opportunity. It didn't seem to come to the right place. And ultimately, it's like, one, you're getting married. And I'm like, yeah, that's a big move. He's like, that's a big move. He's like, two, you're taking a new job. And I'm like, yeah, that seems logical. And he's three, you're relocating for the job. He said, most people would be okay with one of those. Some people would be okay with taking two of those. He's like, but doing all three at the same time, I think you're out of your mind. And I'm like, but that's my risk tolerance, right? And I think that's the element is like, what do I have to lose and what do I have to gain? And I think that's when a lot of folks end up in this mindset, especially security practitioners. We think about everything that can go wrong, right? Like, oh my God, I'm doing this Monte Carlo analysis. This is the thing that's going to go wrong. If I move and the job doesn't work out, my wife's going to leave me. This thing's going to happen. I'm going to get fired. Like, and you start thinking in that. And sometimes it might happen. But I like to think more of the mindset. And this took a little bit of time, honestly. What if it goes right? Right. And that's just a shift in your mindset of like, what if it's positive? What if it's really good? What if everything actually works out? And if you open yourself up to that ideology in your own brain, you open yourself up to more opportunities. And that way, when you go back to what are you willing to sacrifice, sometimes it's not even a sacrifice. Like, are you just willing to be open to taking on new challenges? And I've found a lot of the folks that are willing to go in, and I've been called a mercenary at times, like a corporate mercenary that will go into any environment because I like the challenge. But as you figure out what that tolerance becomes, it can be a little exhausting, to be honest with you. Sometimes the move is not the best thing. Sometimes the move is the absolute perfect thing that you needed in your life, and you fall into the right circle of friends, the right work environment. Everything just fits. And sometimes it doesn't. And I've had both. And I will say, when you go through a year of you've committed to a new job and it's in a bad location you don't like, your partner's not happy with it. And yet you're sitting there like, yeah, we made a bunch of money, but was it worth it? And you have to look back and not regret that decision. So I think some of the challenges that I've faced throughout the career is not just early in defining what is that risk tolerance. It's kind of, it trails throughout, but you take those lessons, you pay it forward, you help other folks along the way. Because again, if you want to stay in your comfort zone, expect your skills, experience, pay to increase at that level. Low risk, low reward, high risk, high reward. And I think that model has proven itself many, many times. Like if you look at co-founders and founders, they're like, hey, we're coming out of school, we're founding a company. Not everyone's successful. We all anchor on the ones that are wildly successful because we'd like to believe that is possible. And I think that's, again, what if everything were to go right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I went through something similar a couple of years ago. I started
Yeah.
a new job, got married, and started a certificate program at a
Yeah.
university all in the same week. And everyone was like, "Are you nuts?" And I'm like, "Yeah, probably."
Yeah.
But
Why not?
you and I are success stories. All right. What are the resources you identified early and mid-career that helped you successfully progress up the ladders?
Yeah, so I've been working full time, not considering that senior year of working when I was still in undergrad, about 14 years, coming up on 15. Like if I go halfway through 7 years, I think a lot of my lessons learned are still the same. Number one, I mentioned it already, having mentors and a personal board of advisors, like call it what you want to call it. You need to have people that you trust that may not have financial incentive on your career. And I think that's something you have to be very conscientious about. And what I mean by that is like your relationships, agreements with companies. So if they're running a company, like sometimes that is favorable because you can get a discount for certain services, but you also have to be careful of bias. But one of the things I really recommend there is someone without bias and having the best interest out for you. So when you're talking about, dude, I just made the wrong decision. I moved to the wrong place. The company that said they were going to tell me to do this and they're going to give me this opportunity, well, it's flipped it on its ear. It is nothing that we agreed to. How do I navigate away or out of this? And it's like, you're an executive now. You got to be in for the long run for a year. Like that's sometimes what it is. And in all honesty, the few key mentors that I've had long term, like Brian Orm, they sometimes just reiterate exactly what you say. And sometimes you need to hear it from that third party to say, this is what I'm hearing from you. And you're like, oh man, yeah, you're right. You're just like, I was thinking that, and just hearing you say it rationalizes it more. Or sometimes they're like, I don't think this is your best decision right now. Like you're saying, you're looking at, the world as far as what you want to do with your development action plan and the steps to get there. If you make this jump and you go to this company and say you go international, how's that going to help your brand grow within the security community in the US? Because sometimes going international doesn't pay the dividends right now. Different time, different place, different country. But just contextually, having that soundbite and that person that helps you make that sort of, I'm going to say educated guess, because you're just getting additional insight into driving there. And, the other two things I'll say is really, I think the one that I really like is surround yourself with people that motivate you. And again, this may go back to your risk tolerance and making sacrifice, but if you're just with the same people, just doing the same things, just in the same cycle, and not breaking your consistent cycle by trying new activities, learning new things, I think that's where it can get a little bit dangerous. And I like the mantra of get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the more you do that, I don't actually know if it's healthy. Like I've done this my whole career of being uncomfortable, being challenged. But there are fundamental things. Like there are three things I'm really good at doing. It's like InfoSec, martial arts, and photography. And like that's where I hang my real pillars in my life. If I lost one, I'm still good. Right. And that's the thing. If I'm just one thing in my identity, like I'm just a security professional, look, I've had some rough days. And then sometimes you're just like, I got to quit this job. Like, I just can't keep doing this. And then you lose that job, you get rid of that job, or you quit too early, or maybe you quit too late. And it has an emotional impact on you. And I think that's something that specific to this field is super risky. You look at the not only alcohol and substance abuse problems across the space in this field, I don't think it's independent of just this field, but you will see a lot of correlation and causation related to CISOs in the community that unfortunately fall into this trap because you do have to self-medicate. You do have to figure out balance. But if you're surrounding yourself with the right people and those sounding boards, same thing with your mentors, I think that helps you get to a good place with staying rational.
Thanks for listening to CISO Insider, a podcast created and sponsored by Nightfall AI, the industry's first cloud-native data loss prevention solution. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. The ratings and reviews help more people find us. Follow Nightfall on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Nightfall AI. That's Nightfall AI, and email us at marketing@nightfall.ai with questions, feedback, and suggestions about CISO Insider, including suggestions for CISOs you'd like to hear from. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next time.